The Galactic Empire had seen countless planets fall under their reign. To them, Earth was just another backwater world. Their fleet descended with the same arrogance that had carried them through 100 victories, convinced that humanity would be no different. The generals in command scoffed at the reports they'd been given. It wasn't the technology they laughed at. Humans had some decently built defenses, but the soldiers. A tired group of veterans, some older than the officers themselves. They shook their heads, amused. These were the warriors the Terran government had sent to defend their planet. The Empire's forces were bred for war, trained from birth to conquer. These human relics wouldn't last an hour. On Earth, the veterans gathered. They weren't the elite of the current Terran military, not anymore. Most of them had seen their prime decades ago, when humanity first ventured out to the stars. These men and women had been through every kind of battle imaginable. Some of them still bore scars from wars long past. To outsiders, they looked slow, tired, and ill-prepared for the kind of combat the Empire was about to unleash. But looks were deceiving. They weren't here because they had something to prove. They weren't here because they thought they were invincible. No, they were here because they understood war in a way the Empire could never comprehend. War wasn't about flashy ships or overwhelming numbers. It was about survival. It was about being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the enemy thought you could be. The Imperial forces hit the ground with precision, their ships humming with advanced tech, their soldiers in perfect formation. They marched forward like a well-oiled machine, every step calculated, every move rehearsed 1,000 times in training. They expected the human defenses to falter immediately, especially with this motley crew of veterans standing in their way. The veterans didn't flinch. The Empire's commanders were eager to end things quickly. They unleashed the first wave, heavy artillery designed to break enemy lines. Explosions lit the sky, fire rained down, and yet, the human lines held. Something wasn't right. The veterans moved like clockwork, unfazed by the Imperial barrage. They weren't rushing, weren't panicking. They anticipated every move the Empire made, adjusting their positions with the ease of soldiers who had fought 100 battles before this one. Every blast that landed seemed to hit nothing but empty terrain. Every advance was met with counterattacks so precise, the Imperial troops barely knew what hit them. Impossible, one Imperial commander muttered under his breath. The veterans didn't need the latest tech or advanced strategies. They had their instincts. Their reflexes, honed over decades of war, were sharper than any machine. Every step they took was calculated, every bullet they fired found its mark. The Empire was stunned. How could these old soldiers be this good? They pressed harder, pushing their forces deeper, convinced that if they just threw enough firepower at the humans, they would break. But it wasn't firepower that won wars. Not always. The veterans knew that better than anyone. A small detachment of the Empire's elite soldiers pushed forward, determined to break through the humans' defenses. They had the advantage: better weapons, better armor, faster reflexes. But as they advanced, something strange happened. They began to fall, one by one, not to overwhelming force, but to pinpoint precision. The humans weren't fighting like the Empire expected. They didn't meet them head-on. They adapted, used the terrain, set traps, and picked off the Imperial soldiers like they were hunting game. The Empire's forces hesitated. What should have been a simple assault had turned into something far more dangerous. The human veterans were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet they fought like they knew something the Empire didn't. They did. War wasn't about brute force. It was about knowing when to strike and when to fall back. It was about patience, waiting for the enemy to overextend, then hitting them where it hurt. The Empire had expected a quick victory, but what they got was a drawn-out battle, one they were slowly losing. The veterans communicated without words, moving as a unit, every man and woman knowing their place in the chaos. They were a well-oiled machine, not because of any fancy tech, but because of years of experience. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, knew exactly how to exploit the cracks in the Empire's strategy. The Imperial commanders watched in disbelief as their troops faltered. These are humans?" one of them whispered. "Yes," another replied, his voice tight with confusion. But not the ones we've fought before. The Empire had fought plenty of humans before, soldiers younger, stronger, faster. But these veterans were something else. They weren't afraid to die, but they weren't eager to either. They fought with a calm, quiet intensity that unnerved the Empire's troops. The first day ended with no clear victor, but the Empire was already on edge. They had lost more soldiers than they cared to admit, and the humans? They hadn't even seen half of what these old soldiers could do. As the Empire regrouped, they realized they were facing something they hadn't planned for. The veterans were more than just soldiers, they were survivors. And if there was one thing survivors knew how to do, it was win. The Empire's forces reassembled after the first day, their confidence shaken but not broken. The commanders refused to admit that they were facing anything other than outdated human tactics. This was just a fluke, they told themselves. These old soldiers couldn't keep up with the pace of a real war, not for long. The second wave would crush them, they assured their troops. As dawn broke, the Empire launched a new assault. This time, they came with a different strategy, overwhelming numbers. Thousands of soldiers poured into the battlefield, flanking from multiple sides, determined to corner the human veterans. The sky filled with drones, their precision-guided missiles targeting every known human position. It was a bombardment meant to break even the strongest defenses. But the veterans had been waiting for this. They had spent the night not resting, but preparing. Their knowledge of battle told them that the Empire would go for a massive offensive next, trying to force the issue. They had set traps, moved their lines, and recalibrated their entire defense. The terrain itself had become their ally, as they knew every inch of it like the back of their hands. The drones struck first, unleashing a rain of fire on what the Empire thought were human strongholds. Explosions rocked the earth, smoke and dust clouding the horizon. Imperial troops advanced in perfect formation, confident that the bombardment had softened up their targets. But as they reached the positions, they found nothing. Just empty craters and debris. The veterans had moved long before the first missiles landed, anticipating every strike. They had dispersed into smaller, more agile groups, using the terrain to their advantage. While the Empire's soldiers stumbled through the rubble, the veterans watched from hidden positions, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, without warning, they did. It wasn't a frontal assault, as the Empire had expected. The veterans didn't fight like that. They didn't charge recklessly into the line of fire. They flanked, ambushed, and picked off the Empire's soldiers one by one. The Imperial troops, used to fighting against more predictable enemies, were caught completely off guard. They couldn't see their attackers, couldn't find a clear target to shoot at. All they knew was that their numbers were dwindling, and fast. The Empire's communications crackled with confusion. Commanders barked orders, trying to reorganize their troops, but it was chaos. The humans had turned the battlefield into a maze of death, where every step forward was met with another trap, another sniper shot, another explosion. What the Empire couldn't understand was that the veterans weren't just fighting with guns and explosives. They were fighting with time. Every second they dragged out the battle was a second the Empire lost. The veterans knew they didn't have the numbers to go toe-to-toe with the Empire's forces, but they didn't need to. All they had to do was outlast them, outmaneuver them, and they were doing it with ruthless efficiency. The Empire's soldiers, though elite, were starting to crack. The precision that had defined their movements was breaking down, replaced by desperation. They started firing blindly into the distance, hoping to hit something, anything, that would stop the relentless attrition they were facing. The veterans stayed calm. They had been in worse situations before, they had faced enemies more terrifying than these aliens, and they had survived. That was the key, survival. They didn't fight for glory, didn't fight for honor. They fought to survive, and that made them dangerous in a way the Empire hadn't anticipated. As the hours dragged on, the Empire's offensive slowed. What should have been a decisive push had turned into a stalemate. Imperial commanders were at a loss, their strategies crumbling in the face of an enemy that refused to fight the way they were supposed to. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that the Empire wasn't gaining any ground. Their soldiers were tired, their morale starting to falter. They had expected the humans to be an easy target, expected their superior technology and numbers to overwhelm them. But instead, they were the ones being worn down, being outmaneuvered by a group of aging warriors who seemed to know every move they were going to make before they made it. The turning point came when one of the Empire's forward bases went silent. No one had noticed it at first, not with the chaos of the battle, but when the base didn't report back during a routine check-in, alarms were raised. A squad was sent to investigate, and what they found sent shockwaves through the Imperial ranks. The base hadn't been attacked with heavy artillery or explosives. It had been infiltrated. The veterans, using their knowledge of stealth and guerrilla tactics, had slipped through the Empire's lines, disabled the guards, and systematically dismantled the base's defenses. Every soldier stationed there had been neutralized without a single shot being fired. This wasn't the work of inexperienced rebels or desperate fighters. This was the work of professionals, seasoned warriors who had been fighting wars long before the Empire even knew Earth existed. The Imperial commanders were livid. How could these old humans, with their outdated weapons and inferior numbers, be doing this? The Empire was supposed to be invincible, their strategies flawless. But here they were, being picked apart piece by a group of veterans who shouldn't even be able to keep up with them. Orders were given to regroup, to fall back and reassess the situation. But even that proved difficult. The Empire's forces, scattered across the battlefield, found themselves cut off from each other, their communication lines severed by the veterans' constant hit-and-run tactics. It was like trying to fight a shadow. Every time they thought they had the humans pinned down, they vanished, only to reappear somewhere else, striking with deadly precision. By the end of the day, the Empire's confidence was shattered. What had begun as a surefire invasion had turned into a nightmare. The human veterans had done the impossible. They had held their ground, outwitted, and outlasted the might of the Galactic Empire. And they weren't done yet. As night fell, the veterans regrouped, their faces tired but determined. They didn't celebrate, didn't boast. They simply prepared for the next day, knowing that the Empire would come again. But they weren't worried. They had fought this battle before, in 100 different ways, on 100 different worlds. And they knew one thing for certain: the Empire wasn't ready for what was coming next. Not by a long shot. The Empire was getting desperate. What should have been a clean, overwhelming victory was slipping through their fingers. Their forces, frustrated and demoralized, were losing faith in their commanders. And those commanders, arrogant and unprepared, were quickly running out of options. It was clear now, these human veterans weren't just relics of some forgotten era. They were masters of warfare, more dangerous than any of the Empire's so-called advanced enemies. The decision was made to change tactics. If brute force wasn't enough to break these humans, then perhaps precision would. The Empire decided to send in its elite forces, commandos trained in infiltration and sabotage, the best of the best. Their mission was simple: penetrate the humans' lines, find the leaders of this veteran group, and take them out. Cut off the head, and the body would fall. Or so they thought. Under the cover of darkness, the Imperial commandos moved into position, slipping past the outer defenses with ease. They had expected more resistance, but there was none. The humans had fallen silent. It was unsettling, but the Empire's elite soldiers pressed on, confident that they could handle whatever the veterans had planned. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. The veterans had been one step ahead the entire time. They knew the Empire would send their elite forces, knew the aliens would try something more subtle. That's why they had set the bait, an open, unguarded path that practically invited the Empire's commandos in. And when those commandos reached what they thought was their objective, they found themselves surrounded. It wasn't a bloody ambush, not at first. The veterans didn't need to waste ammunition or reveal their positions. They used the terrain, the darkness, the very atmosphere of the battlefield to their advantage. The Empire's commandos, once so sure of themselves, found their movements restricted, their escape routes cut off without them even realizing it. Panic began to set in. They had trained for every possible scenario, but nothing had prepared them for this, an enemy that didn't fight like anyone they had ever faced before. As the commandos tried to regroup, the veterans struck. silent, efficient, and ruthless. One by one, the Empire's elite fell. It wasn't a prolonged firefight or a chaotic battle. It was surgical, precise. The veterans didn't just kill, they neutralized their targets with the cold efficiency of soldiers who had done this 1,000 times before. The Empire had underestimated them again, and they paid the price. When the sun rose the next morning, the Imperial forces found the bodies of their elite commandos scattered across the battlefield. It was a message, clear and undeniable: the humans were in control. They had turned the Empire's own tactics against them, and now the aliens were left reeling, unsure of what to do next. The news of the failed commando mission spread quickly through the ranks. The Empire's soldiers, already shaken by the veterans' resilience, now faced the harsh reality that their most elite units had been outclassed. The commanders scrambled to regain control, but the damage was done. Fear was creeping into their troops. The humans weren't just surviving, they were winning. The veterans, meanwhile, continued their relentless campaign of attrition. They knew the Empire was on the defensive now, and they pressed that advantage with everything they had. They didn't need large-scale battles or massive offensives. They chipped away at the Empire's forces bit by bit, turning every skirmish, every engagement into a victory. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. The veterans were proving that even a small, outnumbered force could win, as long as they fought smart. And they fought smarter than anyone the Empire had ever encountered. The Empire, in its desperation, began to make mistakes. They overcommit to certain areas, leaving others vulnerable. They tried to shift tactics too quickly, confusing their own troops. They relied too heavily on their technology, thinking it would save them when brute strength failed. But technology couldn't account for the human factor. It couldn't predict the veterans' creativity, their adaptability, their sheer refusal to be defeated. And then came the counterattack. For days, the veterans had been waiting for the right moment. They hadn't just been defending, they had been preparing, studying the Empire's patterns, looking for weaknesses. And now, with the Empire's forces spread thin and their morale in tatters, the veterans made their move. It wasn't a grand, sweeping assault. That wasn't their style. It was a series of perfectly timed strikes, hitting the Empire where it hurt the most. Supply lines were cut, communication networks disrupted, key outposts destroyed before the Empire even knew what was happening. The veterans moved like ghosts, slipping through the Empire's defenses with ease, striking hard, and disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. The Empire's forces were thrown into chaos. They had expected a slow, grinding war of attrition, but now they were on the receiving end of a coordinated assault that seemed to come from nowhere. Their commanders, panicked and overwhelmed, couldn't keep up. Every decision they made only seemed to make things worse. In the span of a few days, the veterans had turned the tide of the entire war. What had once been a seemingly unstoppable invasion was now a desperate retreat. The Empire's soldiers, their confidence shattered, began to pull back, abandoning positions they had once held with pride. It wasn't just a strategic withdrawal. It was a full-blown retreat, a recognition that they had been beaten by an enemy they had never truly understood. The veterans didn't celebrate. They didn't need to. For them, this was just another battle, another day in a long and bloody career. They had done what they had always done, survived. But they had also shown the Empire something it would never forget: humans weren't just soldiers. They were warriors. And warriors, no matter how old or outnumbered, never stopped fighting. The Empire's defeat was total. Their forces, once so sure of victory, now scrambled to escape with what little they had left. The humans had done the impossible. They had turned the invincible Galactic Empire into a fleeing, broken enemy. And all it had taken was a group of old soldiers who refused to die. As the Empire regrouped for one final assault, their desperation was palpable. This wasn't about victory anymore. It was about saving face, about salvaging something from the disaster that had unfolded. Their forces had been decimated, their best tactics outplayed, and now they were left with no choice but to commit everything they had left to one last, desperate push. It was all or nothing. The veterans knew it was coming. They had seen this before. the frantic scramble of an enemy that knew it had lost but refused to admit it. The Empire was betting everything on overwhelming force, throwing what remained of their army into a single, concentrated attack. This wasn't a strategy, it was panic. But panic could still be dangerous. The veterans had no intention of letting the Empire dictate the terms of the final battle. They had fought too long, too hard, to be backed into a corner now. So they took the initiative, preparing for the Empire's assault with the same calm precision that had defined their every move since the beginning. There was no fear in their ranks, no hesitation. They had fought on the edge of defeat before. This was just another day. When the Empire struck, it did so with the fury of a cornered beast. Their ships unleashed a barrage of firepower, leveling entire sections of the battlefield in an attempt to crush the human defenses once and for all. Their ground troops advanced in waves, determined to push through by sheer force of numbers. The sky darkened with the smoke of war, and the ground shook with the impact of their heavy artillery. But the veterans didn't buckle. They didn't waver. They held their positions with the same unwavering resolve they had shown from the start. Every shot from the Empire was met with a calculated response. Every wave of alien soldiers was met with a wall of fire and steel. The veterans moved like a single unit, their every action coordinated, their every shot precise. What the Empire didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that it wasn't just about numbers. It wasn't just about technology. It was about experience. It was about knowing how to fight, knowing how to survive. And these veterans knew better than anyone how to survive. The Empire's troops, though larger in number, began to falter. They weren't just facing an enemy, they were facing a force that seemed impossible to break. The veterans, despite their age, fought with the endurance of men and women half their years. They anticipated every move the Empire made, countering every strategy with brutal efficiency. The ground beneath them was littered with the wreckage of the Empire's failed attacks. And then, when the time was right, the veterans made their move. They had been waiting for this moment, for the Empire to commit fully, to overextend themselves. They let the alien forces push deep into their defenses, let them believe they were finally breaking through. And when the Empire's troops were fully engaged, when their command structure was spread too thin, the veterans struck. It wasn't a grand, sweeping counterattack. It didn't need to be. It was surgical, targeted. The veterans moved swiftly, bypassing the main assault force and going straight for the heart of the Empire's command. Infiltration teams, disguised by the chaos of the battle, slipped through the gaps in the Empire's lines, heading straight for the command posts and supply lines that kept the assault going. The Empire's commanders never saw it coming. They had been so focused on overwhelming the human defenses that they hadn't even considered the possibility of a counterstrike. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Their communications were cut, their supply lines severed. The ground troops, now isolated and without orders, began to panic. The veterans didn't give them a chance to recover. With their command structure in disarray, the Empire's troops were left vulnerable. The veterans struck hard and fast, exploiting every weakness, every gap in the alien ranks. It was a massacre. The Empire's forces, once so disciplined and confident, were reduced to scattered, confused pockets of soldiers, desperately trying to regroup as the veterans closed in. The final moments of the battle were brutal and decisive. The veterans showed no mercy, cutting through the last of the Empire's troops with ruthless precision. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen alien soldiers, their once proud war machines reduced to smoldering wrecks. The veterans moved through the battlefield with grim determination, finishing what they had started. By the time the dust settled, the Galactic Empire's forces were broken. The survivors, few as they were, fled in disarray, abandoning the battlefield entirely. The invasion had failed. The Empire, once so sure of its victory, had been defeated by a group of soldiers they had dismissed as irrelevant. The veterans, for their part, didn't celebrate. They had won, but there was no joy in it. This wasn't about glory or pride, it was about survival. They had done what needed to be done, nothing more. As they surveyed the battlefield, their expressions were grim, their eyes weary. They had fought their last war, and they had won, but at a cost only they could understand. The Empire, reeling from the defeat, would never forget this battle. The legends of the human veterans, the old soldiers who had turned back the might of the Galactic Empire, would spread across the galaxy. The Empire's enemies would whisper their names, and even their allies would look upon humanity with newfound respect and fear. The veterans, however, simply returned to their lives, as they always had. They weren't interested in being legends. They weren't interested in being remembered. They had done what they were trained to do: fight, survive, and protect the future. And now, with the war behind them, they could finally rest. But the galaxy would never be the same. The Empire had learned a lesson it would never forget: never underestimate humanity, especially its veterans. For in the end, it wasn't the young, strong soldiers that saved Earth, it was the old, battle-hardened warriors who had seen it all and knew how to win a war when it truly mattered.